Part 1. What children truly need is not a childhood without hardship. There is a moment that many parents will experience. It is not the day your child says their first word. It is not the day your child takes their first steps. It is not even the day your child gets top grades or is accepted into a great school. It is the day you realize you can no longer be there to solve every problem for your child. It might be the first day your child walks into a classroom and you are not allowed to go in with them. It might be the first time they are misunderstood by their friends. It might be the first time they fail at something they worked incredibly hard for. Or it may be a day far in the future when your child is already an adult, standing in front of a major decision, a shock, a loss, a life-changing event that you cannot carry for them. That is when everything you have taught your child throughout the years begins to speak, not the long lectures, not the moral lessons, but the way your child's brain responds under pressure, the way their heart faces fear, and the way they talk to themselves when no one else is beside them. That is the real preparation for life. Many parents spend thousands of hours searching for the best school, the best classes, the best teachers, the best opportunities. Yet very few spend that same amount of time asking themselves a far more important question. Am I raising a strong child, or am I simply trying to create a life without storms for my child? Those are two completely different things. A child who grows up with every advantage is not necessarily a strong child. Meanwhile, a child who is prepared in the right way can walk through the hardest seasons of life without losing who they are. That is why developmental psychologists often emphasize that the ability to adapt is more important than the ability to avoid risk. Life never promises to be fair. It never promises that every effort will be rewarded. It never promises that good people will always win. It never promises that the people you love will stay with you forever. Sooner or later, your child will face disappointment, rejection, loneliness, pressure, being misunderstood, days when they feel they are not good enough. That is not pessimism. That is reality. And because it is reality, the most valuable gift parents can give their children is not an umbrella that shields them from every storm for the rest of their lives. It is the ability to keep walking even while it is raining. Interestingly, many studies in developmental psychology have uncovered a paradox. Children who are protected from every difficulty often do not feel safer. Quite the opposite. They tend to become more anxious, more easily overwhelmed, more likely to doubt themselves when real challenges appear. It sounds contradictory. But if you think about it carefully, it makes perfect sense. When a child has never had the opportunity to overcome difficulties on their own, their brain has no evidence that says, "I can do this." Instead, the brain stores a different message. Whenever there is a problem, someone else will solve it. That message quietly follows the child for many years, until adolescence. Then adulthood. They begin facing problems that no one else can solve for them. And that is when confusion appears, not because the problem is too big, but because they have never practiced believing in their own abilities. A psychologist once shared the story of two boys with very similar backgrounds. Both were good students. Both were deeply loved by their parents. Both grew up in stable families. But the way their parents responded to difficulties was completely different. Whenever the first boy encountered a problem, his parents immediately called the teacher. They explained. They intervened. They arranged things. They negotiated. Everything was quickly resolved. The boy hardly had to experience any pressure at all. In contrast, the parents of the second boy always began with one question: "How would you like to handle this?" They did not abandon him. They still listened. They still guided him. But they allowed him to take the first steps himself. Many years later, when both boys entered college, the difference became obvious. The first young man was very intelligent, but he often panicked when unexpected situations arose. Just one criticism was enough to keep him awake for several nights. Meanwhile, the second young man was not necessarily more talented. But he was calmer. When he faced failure, he did not think, "I am useless." He thought, "This is simply a problem that needs to be solved." That difference was not about IQ. It was not about financial circumstances. It was not about the school they attended. It was about the way the brains of those two children had been shaped over many years. One learned to avoid difficulty. The other learned to face it. Those are two completely different paths. Perhaps what unintentionally prevents many parents from supporting their child's growth is not a lack of love. It is loving them in a way that is too afraid to let them experience pain. We see our child feeling disappointed. Our own hearts ache. We see our child being rejected. Our own hearts ache. We see our child crying. And immediately we want to remove whatever made them cry. That is instinct, a beautiful instinct. But sometimes that instinct takes away the very opportunity a child needs to grow. Because there are lessons that only appear after a child has experienced helplessness on their own. There are abilities that can only develop after a child has found their own way out. There is a kind of confidence that no one else can give. It is built only after dozens of moments when a child quietly tells themselves, "I made it through." Neuroscientists call this the brain's adaptive process. Every time a child successfully works through a challenge that matches their level of ability, the neural networks responsible for emotional regulation, decision-making, and problem-solving become stronger. In other words, strength is not an inborn personality trait. It is the result of thousands of small experiences accumulated over time. Unfortunately, in modern society, many children have very few opportunities to experience this. Their schedules are completely full. Their daily routines are planned in advance. Parents make decisions for them. Adults anticipate every possible risk. Everything is optimized so the child will stumble as little as possible. At first glance, that seems like perfect parenting. But sometimes, a life that is planned too carefully prevents children from learning how to adapt when things do not go according to plan. And that is one reason why so many young adults today feel exhausted so quickly when they enter the real world. Not because they are weaker than previous generations, but because they have had fewer opportunities to practice. In the next section, we will explore a very common mistake that is rarely talked about, a habit that many parents see as an expression of love, when in reality, it is quietly weakening their child's confidence, decision-making ability, and independence from the very first years of life. You may even be doing it every single day without realizing it. Part 2. When parents are always one step ahead, their child will always be one step behind in life. There is something very interesting. Many of the things that make parents feel they are loving their children the most are sometimes the very things that quietly take away their children's opportunity to grow. No one does this with bad intentions. In fact, it comes from love, from fear, from the desire to spare their children from the pain they themselves once experienced. Perhaps you were bullied. You do not want your child to cry the way you once did. Perhaps you struggled in school. You try to clear every obstacle from your child's path so they never have to stumble. Perhaps you worked incredibly hard just to make a living. You want your child to focus only on studying because you will take care of everything else. All of these wishes are beautiful, but life always contains a paradox. If parents constantly walk ahead, removing every obstacle, their child will never learn how to overcome obstacles. The dangerous part is that the consequences do not appear immediately. While children are still young, everything seems fine. They cry less, they feel less disappointed, they encounter fewer problems. Parents feel they are doing an excellent job, But then one day their child enters an environment where their parents are no longer present, a new classroom, a first job, a marriage, a different city. At that point, life will ask questions that parents cannot answer for, and if, throughout all the years before that, the child has never practiced handling things on their own, even a small challenge can become an overwhelming burden. Psychologists call this dependence on external competence. Simply put, the brain gradually develops the belief that, I can only do this if someone guides me. I only feel safe when someone is standing behind me. I am not sure whether my decisions are the right ones. That is why so many adults constantly ask for other people's opinions before making even the smallest decisions. What should I eat? What should I wear? Where should I apply? Should I quit my job? Should I end a relationship that no longer makes me happy? It is not because they lack intelligence. It is because they were never given the chance to develop confidence in themselves. That confidence does not suddenly appear when someone turns 18 years old. It is built through countless tiny choices made throughout childhood. For example, a child stands in front of the closet. They are trying to choose between two shirts. An adult notices and immediately says, "Wear the blue one." It seems like such a small thing, but imagine it happening every single day. Which food to eat, which pair of shoes to wear, which book to bring, who to play with, which class to sign up for. The adult is always the one making the decision. Eventually, the child no longer develops the habit of making choices independently. They begin asking, "Mom, what should I do?" What is worth noticing is that many parents actually feel happy when they hear that question. They think, "My child is so obedient." When sometimes, what that question really reflects is that the child does not yet trust their own ability to make decisions. Of course, young children still need guidance. No one is saying you should let them do whatever they want. The difference lies in how that guidance is given. There are two kinds of parents. The first kind immediately gives the answer. The second kind asks a question. Those two approaches build two completely different kinds of brains. Imagine an 8-year-old girl bringing home a drawing. She asks, "What color should I paint the sky?" If her parents immediately answer, "Blue," she gets an answer. But if they smile and ask, "If this is the sky in your story, what would you like it to look like?" The child's brain begins to work. She imagines, she compares, she makes a choice, she evaluates, she decides. That is when the parts of the brain responsible for independent thinking become active. This does not apply only to art, it applies to every area of life. Instead of saying, "You need to apologize," try asking, "What do you think would help your friend feel better right now?" Instead of saying, "You did it wrong," try asking, "If you could do it again, what would you change?" Instead of saying, "I will take care of it," try asking, "Where would you like to start?" At first, your child may answer very slowly. Sometimes they may stay silent. Sometimes they may simply say, "I don't know." That is completely normal, because independent thinking is just like a muscle. If it has never been exercised, it will be weak. But every time it is used, it becomes stronger. An interesting study on cognitive development found that children whose parents regularly ask open-ended questions develop stronger planning skills and become more flexible problem solvers as adults. What is especially interesting is that this difference does not come from IQ. It comes from thinking habits, because the brain develops according to what it is used for most often. If the brain constantly receives answers, it learns to wait. If the brain is constantly challenged to find answers, it learns to explore. One father once shared a story that left a lasting impression. His son was about 10 years old. One morning, the boy forgot his homework at home. He called in a panic. "Dad, could you bring it to school for me?" The father looked at the notebook lying on the table. He had plenty of time to take it to school, But after a few moments of silence, he asked, "What do you think you could do instead?" There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then the boy said, "I'll tell my teacher the truth." That day, he was reminded by the teacher. His grade was not very good either. When he came home, he felt disappointed. But something interesting happened a few weeks later. Another time, he forgot something again. This time, he did not call his father. He found a way to borrow what he needed from a classmate. It was not perfect, but it was his own solution. That is what growth looks like. Not because he never made mistakes again, but because he began believing that he was capable of handling his own mistakes. That is the most valuable belief a person can ever possess. No one is born confident. Confidence does not come from praise. It comes from overcoming difficulties with your own efforts. Every time a child successfully handles a task, no matter how small, the brain records a positive message. "I can do this." That message repeats itself hundreds of times, then thousands of times, until it becomes part of who they are. As they grow older, when they face a new challenge, they no longer think, "Am I good enough?" Instead, they think, "I don't know how yet, but I can learn." That is the difference between someone who lives in fear and someone who is willing to keep moving forward. Part 3. What hurts a child is not always the hardship itself, but the way adults respond to their emotions. There is a belief that has existed in many families for generations, that a strong child is a child who does not cry, who does not complain, who is not afraid, who does not show emotion. And because of that belief, many adults unintentionally spend their children's entire childhood teaching them how to hide what is happening inside. When a child cries, we say, "You're crying over something so small." When a child feels afraid, we reply, "Don't be so scared." When a child gets angry, we say, "Be quiet right now." When a child feels sad, we try to change the subject as quickly as possible. Those words usually do not come from a lack of love. Most of the time, parents simply want their child to feel better as quickly as possible. They want their child to become stronger. They do not want negative emotions to overwhelm them. But a child's brain understands those moments in a very different way. What the child hears is not, "My parents want to help me." What the child hears is, "My feelings are wrong. I shouldn't be sad. I shouldn't be afraid. I shouldn't be angry." So, from a very early age, children begin learning how to hide their emotions instead of learning how to understand them. That is an enormous difference, because emotions that are hidden do not disappear. They simply change form. Sadness that is never heard may become withdrawal. Fear that is never acknowledged may become long-lasting anxiety. Anger that is constantly pushed down may eventually explode at a completely unrelated moment. Many studies in developmental psychology show that emotional regulation does not begin with children controlling themselves. It begins with having an adult who is calm enough to stay with them through their emotions. In other words, before children can learn to calm themselves, they first need to experience what it feels like for someone else to help calm them. That is the foundation. Not indulgence, but emotional co-regulation. This is a concept that many neuroscientists have emphasized in recent years. A young child's brain is still developing, especially the areas responsible for emotional regulation and decision-making. When a child feels terrified or overwhelmingly angry, the emotional centers of the brain become highly active. Meanwhile, the rational part of the brain temporarily becomes much less effective. That is why many children become even less able to calm down the more they are yelled at, not because they are being defiant, but because, in that moment, their brain is simply not capable of doing what adults are demanding. If the adult also loses control, two stressed nervous systems collide, and the conversation almost completely loses its value. On the other hand, when the adult remains calm, speaks more slowly, looks at the child with gentleness, and moves in a steady, reassuring way, the child's nervous system begins receiving a message. I am still safe. Once that sense of safety returns, the thinking part of the brain gradually comes back online. Only then can the child truly listen. This explains why some parents rarely raise their voices, yet their children are still cooperative. It is not because those children are naturally better behaved. It is because they feel safer. A family counselor once shared a story. A 9-year-old boy came home looking deeply disappointed. He had just been cut from the school's soccer team. The moment he walked through the door, he burst into tears. His mother felt heartbroken for him, but her first response was, "Don't be sad. You can try harder next time." It sounded encouraging. It sounded positive. But the little boy became completely silent. Throughout dinner, he barely said a word. A week later, during a session with a counselor, the mother was encouraged to try something different. The next time something like this happened, she was told not to rush into fixing her son's feelings. She should stay with those feelings first. A few months later, the boy experienced another disappointment. This time, his mother simply sat down beside him. She spoke softly. "I imagine this must have been really disappointing for you." The boy nodded. The two of them sat quietly for almost a full minute. No one tried to solve anything. Then, unexpectedly, the boy said, "I think next time I'll practice more." He was the one who found the next step forward. Not because his mother had given better advice, but because this time, he did not have to spend all of his energy fighting against the feeling of being emotionally dismissed. He was allowed to feel sad, and once that sadness was accepted, he finally had enough emotional space to think about what to do next. That is something many parents unintentionally miss. We rush to fix, we rush to encourage, we rush to teach, so quickly that we forget something important. Sometimes what children need most is not a solution. It is the feeling of being understood. This affects far more than childhood. It also shapes the way children will face themselves when they become adults. Imagine two adults experiencing the same failure. The first person grew up in an environment where every emotion was acknowledged. When they felt sad, they knew they were sad. When they felt afraid, they admitted they were afraid. They did not feel ashamed of their emotions. They saw emotions as signals that helped them understand themselves. The second person grew up believing, "Don't be weak, don't cry, don't complain." When life brought hardship, they tried to suppress everything. On the outside, they appeared strong, but on the inside, they became more exhausted with every passing day. Many adults seek help from therapists not because they do not know how to solve problems, but because they never learned how to name what they are feeling. They only know that they are tired, they are stressed, they feel empty, but they do not understand why. Very often, the roots of that struggle reach all the way back to childhood, to a time when no one ever asked, "How is your heart feeling today?" There is one very simple skill that every family can begin practicing tonight. Every day, instead of asking only, "What grade did you get today? What did you eat today? Did you finish your homework?" Spend a few minutes asking different kinds of questions. What made you smile the most today? Was there anything today that made you feel uncomfortable? If you could go back and change one moment from today, what would it be? Those questions do more than help parents understand their children. More importantly, they help children develop an incredibly valuable habit, the habit of paying attention to their own inner world. Over time, children begin to understand that emotions are not the enemy. They are simply information. Feeling sad does not mean being weak. Feeling afraid does not mean failing. Feeling angry does not mean being a bad person. Every emotion is trying to tell us something. A child who understands this will not spend a lifetime running away from their emotions. They will learn to listen to them, to regulate them, and to move forward with them. That is what true emotional strength looks like. In the next section, we will explore another factor that is often underestimated, yet has an enormous impact on a child's ability to overcome adversity. It is the way parents respond when their children make mistakes. Because some children grow up believing that making mistakes is something to be ashamed of, while others grow up seeing every stumble as an opportunity to grow, and that belief will shape the way they face life for years to come. Part 4. What makes a child fear? Life is not failure itself, but the fear of no longer being loved after they fail. There is something that many people do not realize until they become adults. They are not truly afraid of failure. What they are afraid of is the feeling of being judged after they fail. They are afraid of being criticized, afraid of disappointing others, afraid of the silent look in their parents' eyes, afraid of feeling that they are no longer good enough. The sad part is that this fear is rarely created in a single day. It is built through hundreds of very small experiences throughout childhood. A poor test score, a cup accidentally dropped on the floor, a game they did not win, a forgotten homework assignment, a perfectly ordinary mistake. But if, after every one of those moments, the first thing a child receives is criticism, disappointment, or comparison, their brain slowly begins to form an incredibly dangerous belief. I am only lovable when I do well. Psychologists call this conditional self-worth. The child no longer measures their value by who they are. They begin measuring it by their achievements. If they succeed, they feel worthy. If they fail, they feel worthless. The problem is that no one can succeed forever. There will always be days when life does not go as planned. If a person's entire sense of worth is tied to results, every failure will feel like a direct blow to their self-esteem. That is why many highly talented people live under constant pressure. They do not dare try something new. They do not dare accept difficult opportunities. They do not dare begin the project they truly care about, not because they lack ability, but because they are afraid of failure. In truth, they are not afraid of failure. They are afraid that failure will make them no longer worthy of love. A professor of educational psychology once said something deeply thought-provoking. A child who never stops striving to be perfect is not searching for success. They are searching for safety. At first, those words may sound confusing. But think back to your own childhood. Have you ever brought home a test, and the first thing you thought was not what you had learned, but, I wonder how my parents are going to react? If your answer is yes, then perhaps you already understand what so many children feel. When love and achievement become unintentionally tied together, children begin hiding their mistakes. They start lying to avoid being scolded. They hide their grades. They hide their failures. They even hide their true feelings, not because they are bad children, but because their brain is trying to protect the most important relationship in their life, their connection with their parents. This is explained clearly in the attachment theory developed by psychologist John Bowlby. For a child, feeling loved and accepted is a basic survival need. If children believe that love is conditional, their nervous system remains constantly on alert. They spend enormous amounts of emotional energy trying not to make mistakes, instead of using that energy to learn. A 12-year-old girl once told a counselor, "I'm not afraid of getting a bad grade. I'm only afraid that my mom won't talk to me." Her words left the entire room in silence, because what hurt her most was not the test. It was the feeling of emotional distance. Perhaps many parents never intended to create that feeling. Sometimes they simply become quiet because they are disappointed. Sometimes they want their child to reflect on what happened. Sometimes they believe silence will help the lesson last longer. But to a child, prolonged silence can sometimes feel even more frightening than harsh words. They no longer know whether they are still loved. They no longer know whether they are still safe, and that uncertainty gradually becomes a fear of failure. So what should happen when a child makes a mistake? The first step is not the lesson. The first step is connection. That does not mean ignoring the mistake. It does not mean becoming permissive. It means helping the child understand you made a mistake, but you are not a bad child. Those are two completely different messages. When parents say, "You are so careless," children often hear, "I am a careless person." But if parents say, "This didn't go well. Let's look at what happened together," the mistake becomes separate from the child's identity. That is an enormous difference. There is a father who once shared a story about his 14-year-old son. One day, the boy accidentally broke the family's very expensive camera. The moment he heard it hit the floor, the father rushed over. The first thing he noticed was not the camera. It was the terrified look on his son's face. The boy was not crying. He simply stood there, completely frozen. Because at that moment, there was only one thought running through his mind. "I'm done for." The father took a slow, deep breath. He felt the loss too. That camera was something very valuable. But he also knew that if he allowed his anger to take over, the lesson his son would remember would not be how to become more careful. It would be fear. He gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said, "I know you didn't do it on purpose. Now let's see whether there's a way we can fix it together." Many years later, the young man said he could barely remember the camera. But he remembered that day with complete clarity. It was the first time in his life that he truly understood something. He could make a mistake and still be loved. That memory stayed with him all the way into adulthood. Research in neuroscience shows that when people feel emotionally safe, the brain learns far more effectively. On the other hand, when the nervous system is trapped in fear, the parts of the brain responsible for learning and memory become much less effective. That means a child who is afraid of being scolded will struggle to absorb the lesson their parents are trying to teach. Instead, their attention is focused almost entirely on one thing: how to make the anger stop. That is why the most meaningful conversations rarely happen immediately after a mistake. Sometimes the wisest thing parents can do is give both themselves and their child a little time. Time for both nervous systems to settle down. Then come back together and reflect on what happened, not to find someone to blame, but to discover what can be learned. There is one question every parent should remember. After every mistake your child makes, ask yourself, what will my child remember after this conversation? Will they remember, "I am useless"? Or will they remember, "I can do better next time"? Only a few different words. Yet those words can shape two completely different lives. In the next section, we will explore the final piece of the puzzle. Perhaps the most influential one of all. It is not the lessons parents teach. It is not the rules they create. It is the example they live every single day. Because before children become the people their parents hope they will be, they almost always become the people they watch every day. And perhaps no lecture in the world is more powerful than that. Part 5. The greatest gift parents leave behind is not what they say, but the person they choose to be every day. There is one question every parent should ask themselves. If one day your child forgets every lesson you ever taught, what will still remain? It may sound surprising, but research in child development has shown again and again that children do not learn primarily from what adults explain to them. They learn from what they observe. Every day, every hour, every single moment, even when no one is intentionally teaching them anything. There was an interesting study on family behavior. Researchers asked parents to list the qualities they hoped their children would have as adults. The lists were almost identical: kindness, resilience, responsibility, emotional self-control, respect for others, compassion. Then the researchers asked one more question: How many times each day does your child actually see you demonstrating those qualities? The room became quiet, because the gap between what parents hope for and what parents model is often much bigger than we realize. A father constantly tells his child to stay calm, yet becomes angry after sitting in traffic for only a few minutes. A mother repeatedly teaches her child to be honest, yet says, if someone calls, tell them I'm not home. A family emphasizes the importance of gratitude, yet every dinner conversation revolves around what is still missing. Children notice all of it. They may never say anything, but their brains are recording everything, day after day, year after year. Those images slowly become the child's definition of how life works. That is why so many adults eventually realize they respond to life exactly the way their parents did, not because they chose to, but because that is what their brain learned from the very beginning. Scientists call this observational learning. It is one of the most powerful ways human beings learn. When children watch adults face a challenge, their brains do not simply remember the behavior. They also remember how emotions are handled. If parents stay calm and look for solutions whenever life becomes difficult, children gradually begin seeing that as a normal response. If every conflict is met with shouting or with days of silence, children will also believe that is how conflicts are supposed to be handled. No one has to teach it. No one has to explain it. Daily life is the greatest classroom of all. One mother once shared a story that completely changed the way she raised her child. One afternoon, she accidentally knocked over a glass of water. Out of habit, she immediately said, "I'm so clumsy." Her 5-year-old son stood beside her, watching quietly for a few seconds. Then he smiled and said, "It's okay, Mom. You can just wipe it up." The mother suddenly became silent. Those were the exact words she always used whenever her son accidentally dropped something. In that moment, she realized something important. Her son was not only learning how she treated him, he was also learning how she treated herself. If parents constantly criticize themselves, constantly saying, "I'm terrible," "I can't do anything right," "I'm useless," then one day their child will very likely speak to themselves in exactly the same way, because children assume that is how adults are supposed to talk to themselves. On the other hand, if parents can admit mistakes without attacking their own worth, their children will learn that too. For example, instead of saying, "I'm such a terrible mother," try saying, "I didn't handle that very well. I'll do it differently next time." It is only a small change, but it sends an incredibly important message. People can make mistakes, but mistakes do not define their value. That is a lesson many people spend decades trying to learn. Do you know what makes many children feel the safest? It is not having parents who are always right. It is having parents who are willing to admit when they are wrong. A sincere apology from a parent does not reduce a child's respect. Quite the opposite. It teaches humility, responsibility, and courage. One father shouted at his son because of a misunderstanding. Later that evening, he walked into his son's room. He sat beside the bed and quietly said, "I'm sorry. I reacted too quickly today. I should have listened to you first." The boy said nothing. He simply hugged his father. Years later, after becoming an adult, he shared that this was the first time he truly understood something. Strong people are not those who never make mistakes. Strong people are those who have the courage to admit them. No book could ever have taught that lesson more powerfully than that moment. Perhaps, after everything we have talked about in today's video, you will come to realize one important truth. What determines whether a child stands strong in life is not how many hardships parents remove from their path. It is what parents help build inside them. A child will not remember every toy they ever owned. They will not remember every expensive gift. They will not remember every piece of advice their parents gave them. but they will remember how they felt when they were with you. They will remember whether home was a place where they were allowed to fail. They will remember whether they were truly listened to whenever they felt afraid. They will remember whether, after every stumble, someone looked at them with disappointment or with confidence that they could stand back up. And one day, you may no longer be able to walk beside your child through every stage of life. You will not be there for every exam, every job interview, every relationship, every hardship. But if, throughout those early years, you helped your child build trust in themselves, if you taught them that emotions are never something to be ashamed of, if you allowed them to experience responsibility instead of controlling everything, if you showed them that failure is simply part of growing up, if you lived according to the very values you hoped they would have, then, even when you are no longer standing beside them, there will still be a part of you living within them. It will be the voice that reminds them to stay calm when life becomes chaotic, the courage that helps them stand up after failure, the kindness that guides them to treat others with compassion, the belief that they can always learn, change, and begin again. That is the greatest legacy a parent can leave behind. Not wealth, not reputation, not what is left in a bank account, but a human being strong enough to walk through life on their own feet while still remaining compassionate enough never to lose their humanity. If there is only one thing you take away from today's video, let it be this: every conversation you have with your child, every time you choose to listen instead of judge, every time you choose patience instead of anger, every time you allow your child to search for the answer instead of doing it for them, every time you have the courage to admit your own mistakes, you are not simply solving today's problem. You are quietly shaping the person your child will become 20, 30, or even 50 years from now. And perhaps one day, when your child becomes a parent too, the seeds you plant today will continue growing into another generation. That is how strong families are built, not by perfect people, but by people who are always willing to learn, to love, and to grow together. Thank you for staying with us until the end of today's video. If today's message gave you a reason to pause and reflect on your own parenting journey, take a moment to share this video with someone you care about. Perhaps one new perspective today could change the childhood of a child tomorrow. And always remember, you do not need to become a perfect mother or a perfect father. What your child has always needed is not perfection. What they need is someone who is always willing to love them, walk beside them, and grow together with them through every stage of life.